What's up, everyone? Tonight, imagine for a moment that you're standing in the darkest corner of Victorian London, where gaslight barely penetrates the fog, and every shadow might conceal history's most elusive predator. You're about to step into a world where poverty wears a threadbare coat, where desperation sleeps in doorways, and where someone, or something, stalks the narrow streets with surgical precision and an appetite for terror. So before you get comfortable, like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with your city and what time it is where you are right now. I always love knowing where in the world you're joining me for these midnight journeys through history's mysteries. Now turn off the lights, maybe switch on a fan for that gentle background sound, and let's begin our journey tonight. You find yourself standing on the cobblestones of Whitechapel in the autumn of 1888, and the first thing that hits you isn't the sight, it's the smell. Unwashed bodies, horse dung, coal smoke, and something else. Something sweetly rotten that clings to the back of your throat like a whisper you can't quite understand. The air itself feels thick, almost chewy, as if the poverty and desperation of 30,000 souls has somehow crystallized into something you can taste. Your feet navigate carefully around the puddles of, well, let's call it water, though you suspect it's carrying passengers you'd rather not meet. The cobblestones beneath your boots are slick with a combination of rain, refuse, and the general dampness that seems to seep from the very bones of these buildings. Gas lamps flicker like dying fireflies, casting circles of sickly yellow light that somehow make the darkness beyond them feel even more impenetrable. You can't help but think that if Jack the Ripper was looking for the perfect hunting ground, he couldn't have ordered it better from a catalog of urban nightmares. The mainstream historical fact that everyone knows is that Jack the Ripper killed 5 women in Whitechapel between August and November 1888. But here's what your history teacher probably didn't mention. Whitechapel wasn't just poor. It was a deliberate dumping ground. The Victorian establishment had essentially created a concentrated zone of misery, pushing the unwanted, the desperate, and the inconvenient into this roughly 1 square mile area. It was poverty by design, a social experiment in how much human suffering you could pack into a single neighborhood before something gave way. You pass a woman leaning against a brick wall, her dress patched with fabric that doesn't quite match, her face bearing the particular exhaustion that comes from choosing between rent and food. She might be 25 or 45. Malnutrition and hardship have a way of making age irrelevant. Around her, children dart between your legs like quick shadows, their bare feet silent on the wet stones. They're playing some version of tag that involves dodging horse-drawn carts and avoiding the attention of adults who might put them to work. The buildings lean inward, as if they're trying to whisper secrets to each other, their upper floors practically touching across the narrow streets. Windows glow with the warm amber of candlelight and oil lamps, but somehow that warmth can't quite penetrate the chill that seems to emanate from the very architecture itself. You notice that even the wealthy areas of London feel more secure than this. Here, every doorway is a potential ambush, every alley a dead end with possibilities you'd rather not contemplate. Here's a curiosity that most people don't know. The infamous 10 Bells pub, which still stands today, and where several of the Ripper's victims were known to drink, was actually considered one of the nicer establishments in the area. When the nice pub looks like something from a Gothic novel, you begin to understand just how deep the desperation runs in these streets. The gin palaces of Whitechapel weren't just businesses. They were escape hatches from a reality that had become too heavy to carry sober. You step around a group of men huddled around a small fire in a metal drum, their faces illuminated by the dancing flames. They're sharing something from a bottle wrapped in brown paper, and their conversation stops when they notice you passing. Not threatening exactly, but watchful in the way that people become when survival depends on knowing who belongs and who doesn't. One of them tips his cap politely, and you're struck by how courtesy persists even in these circumstances, how human dignity finds a way to flower in the most unlikely soil. The sound of your footsteps echoes off the brick walls, creating a rhythm that seems to sync with your heartbeat. Somewhere in the distance, you hear the clip-clop of horse hooves on cobblestones, the creak of wooden cartwheels, and occasionally, the sharp whistle of a police constable. But these sounds feel muffled, as if the fog and the very weight of human misery is absorbing them before they can travel far. Historians still debate whether the conditions in Whitechapel were the primary factor that allowed Jack the Ripper to operate so successfully, or if his success was more about the limitations of Victorian police methods. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Like most historical mysteries, it's not a single answer, but a perfect storm of circumstances that created the ideal conditions for horror to flourish. You pause at the corner of Dorset Street, which contemporary accounts described as the worst street in London. Standing here, you can almost feel the weight of that reputation pressing down on you like a heavy coat. The buildings seem to sag under the burden of too many lives packed into too little space. Too many stories of desperation and small kindnesses and everyday heroism that history has forgotten in favor of focusing on one particular monster. As you take in the scene around you, breathing in the complex mixture of coal smoke and human persistence, you realize that understanding Jack the Ripper means first understanding this world he chose to hunt in. A world where people disappeared all the time for reasons that had nothing to do with serial killers, starvation, disease, industrial accidents, or simply the crushing weight of poverty. A world where the difference between victim and survivor was often just a matter of being in the right doorway when the footsteps approached. The fog swirls around your ankles like curious cats, and you find yourself wondering, in a place where death was already so commonplace, how did 5 murders manage to terrorize an entire city? The answer, you suspect, lies not just in what happened, but in how it happened, and in the particular brand of fear that comes when someone chooses your nightmare as their playground. You're standing on Bucks Row now, though they've renamed it Durward Street, as if changing the name could somehow wash away what happened here on that cool August morning in 1888. The cobblestones beneath your feet are the same ones that Mary Ann Nichols walked across in her final moments, though they've been scrubbed clean by more than a century of rain and the determined forgetting that cities do so well. It's 3:40 in the morning, and the fog clings to the street like a guilty secret. You can almost hear the echo of Police Constable John Neal's footsteps as he makes his rounds, the leather soles of his boots creating a steady rhythm against the stones. The gas lamp above flickers with that particular Victorian uncertainty, casting a circle of weak yellow light that seems to emphasize the darkness beyond, rather than dispel it. You find yourself thinking that street lighting in 1888 was rather like Victorian medicine, well-intentioned but ultimately making you wonder if the cure might be worse than the disease. The silence is so complete that when you hear it, the soft thud of something being discovered, it seems to echo off every brick wall in Whitechapel. P.C. Neal has found something that doesn't belong in his orderly nighttime world, something that will transform him from an ordinary constable making his rounds into the first person to stumble across what history will remember as the beginning of the Jack the Ripper murders. You watch as his lantern beam falls across the figure, lying against the gated entrance to a stable yard. Mary Ann Nichols, 43 years old, lies on her back with her skirts pulled up, and her throat cut so deeply that the wound gapes like a second mouth. But here's what strikes you most: the positioning. She's been arranged, composed almost, as if someone took time to create a particular tableau. This isn't the chaotic aftermath of a street robbery gone wrong. This is something else entirely, something that speaks to intention and a mind that thinks in patterns. The mainstream historical fact that everyone knows is that Mary Ann Nichols was an alcoholic prostitute who had been in and out of workhouses. But here's what they don't tell you in the history books. She was also a mother of 5, a woman who had worked as a domestic servant, and someone who just hours before her death had been laughing with friends about earning enough money for a bed rather than sleeping rough. She wasn't just a victim. She was a person who made jokes about her circumstances, who had favorite songs, and who kept a comb in her pocket as if maintaining dignity was an act of quiet rebellion against a world determined to strip it away. P.C. Neal's whistle pierces the morning air, sharp and urgent, and within minutes the scene transforms from solitary discovery to official investigation. You watch Dr. Reese Ralph Llewellyn arrive, his medical bag in hand, and his demeanor suggesting a man who's seen enough death to approach it professionally, but not callously. He kneels beside Marianne's body, and in the lamplight, you can see his expression change as he realizes this isn't just another unfortunate death in Whitechapel. The precision of the cuts, the deliberate nature of the positioning, suggests something far more calculated. What's fascinating is how quickly the story begins to grow legs. By dawn, neighbors are gathering at their windows, and by afternoon, the press has caught wind of what happened on Bucks Row. You can almost see the narrative taking shape in real time, transforming from unfortunate woman found dead to mysterious murder in Whitechapel, to something that will eventually become the stuff of legend. It's like watching the birth of a modern media sensation, except with considerably more gas lamps and fewer smartphones. The details that emerge paint a picture of Marianne's final hours that feels almost mundane in its ordinariness. She'd been drinking at the Frying Pan pub, arguing with her lodging house deputy about the 4 pence she needed for a bed, wandering the streets with a combination of optimism and resignation that seems particularly Victorian. She'd told a friend she'd soon be back when she had the money, a phrase that echoes through the investigation like a promise she was never able to keep. Here's a curiosity that most people don't know. The first police surgeon to examine Marianne's body missed the abdominal wounds entirely. Dr. Llewellyn focused on the obvious throat cuts and declared her dead from those injuries. It wasn't until she was undressed at the mortuary that the more extensive mutilations were discovered. Cuts that suggested anatomical knowledge and a level of post-mortem interference that elevated this from a simple murder to something much more disturbing. You follow the trail of evidence as it moves from Bucks Row to the mortuary, watching how each new discovery changes the shape of the investigation. The police initially assume they're dealing with a domestic dispute gone wrong, or perhaps a robbery. The idea that this might be the work of someone who kills for the sake of killing, who treats human beings as materials for some twisted artistic expression, hasn't quite crystallized yet. But you can see it forming in the worried glances between officers, in the way they start paying more attention to shadows. Historians still debate whether Marianne Nichols was actually the first canonical victim, or whether Emma Elizabeth Smith and Martha Tabram, killed earlier that year, should be included in the official count. The truth is that Whitechapel in 1888 was experiencing what we might now call a spike in violent crime against women, and determining where random violence ended and deliberate serial killing began requires drawing lines that the evidence doesn't always support clearly. The investigation into Marianne's death reveals the limitations of Victorian police work in ways that are almost endearing in their earnestness. They measure everything with tape measures and record observations in careful copperplate handwriting, but they don't think to preserve the crime scene or collect trace evidence in ways that would become standard procedure. It's like watching someone try to solve a crossword puzzle with half the clues missing and a pencil that keeps breaking. As you stand in the spot where Marianne Nichols was found, you're struck by how ordinary it seems. No dramatic lighting, no ominous music, just a narrow street in East London where someone's life ended and someone else's legend began. The fog swirls around your ankles, and you find yourself wondering about that moment when P.C. Neal first spotted her body, the split second when routine became history, when an ordinary night shift became the beginning of the most famous unsolved case in criminal history. The morning light begins to creep across the cobblestones, and you realize that this is just the beginning. Marianne Nichols's death was terrible enough, but it was also an announcement, a calling card from someone who wasn't finished yet. As you prepare to leave Bucks Row, you carry with you the weight of knowing that this quiet street was where it all started, where history's most notorious killer first introduced himself to the world with surgical precision and theatrical flair. You find yourself walking through the early morning mist toward Hanbury Street, where the cobblestones still hold the chill of dawn, and the gas lamps flicker like tired eyes that haven't quite decided whether to give up and go to sleep. It's September 8th, 1888, just 8 days after Marianne Nichols was found on Bucks Row, and Whitechapel is still processing that first shock when history decides to deliver a second, more devastating blow. The fog clings to the brick buildings like a Victorian lady's perfume, persistent, slightly overwhelming, and impossible to escape once it's settled in for the visit. You can smell the mixture of coal smoke, unwashed wool, and that particular dampness that comes from too many people living in too small a space with too little hope. But there's something else in the air this morning. Something that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up like a cat sensing a thunderstorm still hours away. At number 29 Hanbury Street, you approach the narrow passage that leads to the backyard of a lodging house. The building itself looks tired, as if it's been holding up the weight of human misery for so long that its very bricks have started to sag with exhaustion. The wooden fence that separates the backyard from the street stands about 5.5 feet high, tall enough to provide privacy, low enough for someone determined to climb over it without too much difficulty. You can't help but think that whoever designed this particular barrier clearly hadn't considered that privacy could be a double-edged sword. John Davis, a porter who lives in the building, descends the stairs from his room just after 6 in the morning, planning to head to his work at Leadenhall Market. It's the kind of ordinary morning routine that millions of people perform without thinking. Wake up, get dressed, head downstairs, step outside. Except this morning, John Davis is about to become the second person in 8 days to discover that someone in Whitechapel has developed a very particular and very disturbing hobby. You watch as he opens the back door and steps into the small yard, perhaps thinking about the day ahead, maybe wondering if there'll be enough work at the market to put food on his table. The fog swirls around his feet as he moves toward the steps that lead down to the yard, and then he stops. Freezes, actually, as if someone has just whispered something impossible in his ear. Annie Chapman lies near the steps, her body positioned against the fence in a way that immediately tells you this wasn't where she died. She was moved, arranged, displayed like a horrific piece of street theater. At 47, she'd been known around Whitechapel as Dark Annie, a woman who sold flowers when she could, sought other work when she couldn't, and had been battling consumption and poverty with the kind of grim determination that seemed to be issued as standard equipment to working-class Victorian women. The mainstream historical fact that everyone knows is that Annie Chapman was the second canonical victim of Jack the Ripper. But here's what doesn't make it into most of the dramatic retellings. Annie had been a wife and mother, someone who had run a boarding house with her husband, who had fallen into poverty only after his death and her own declining health. Just 2 days before her murder, she'd been in the casual ward of Whitechapel Workhouse, and witnesses later said she'd seemed unusually cheerful for someone sleeping rough. John Davis's scream pierces the morning air like a factory whistle, sharp and urgent, and completely inappropriate for the gentle fog and sleepy neighborhood. Within minutes, the yard fills with neighbors, police constables, and Dr. George Bagster Phillips, whose examination of Annie's body will reveal details that make Marianne Nichols's murder look almost restrained by comparison. What strikes you most about the scene is the deliberate nature of everything. Annie's possessions, a few coins, some pills, 2 farthings, and a piece of muslin, have been arranged near her feet with an almost ritualistic precision. It's as if the killer took time not just to murder, but to curate the aftermath, creating a tableau that speaks to a mind operating according to some internal logic that the rest of us can only glimpse in fragments. Here's a curiosity that most people don't know. The fence behind which Annie Chapman was killed and mutilated was only about 14 inches wide, barely enough space for one person to kneel comfortably, let alone perform the extensive post-mortem mutilations that Dr. Phillips documented. This spatial constraint suggests either incredible boldness on the killer's part, or a level of anatomical efficiency that speaks to practice, knowledge, or both. The investigation into Annie's death reveals a timeline that should terrify anyone who thinks about crime prevention. She was last seen alive at 5:30 a.m., talking to a man outside the very lodging house where she would be found dead 30 minutes later. The killer had perhaps half an hour to commit the murder, perform extensive mutilations, arrange the scene, and escape. all while neighbors slept just feet away on the other side of thin walls. Dr. Phillips's examination reveals injuries that go far beyond what was done to Mary Ann Nichols. Annie's throat has been cut so deeply that her head is nearly severed. But that's just the beginning. The abdominal mutilations show a progression, an escalation that suggests the killer is becoming more confident, more elaborate in his work. It's like watching someone perfect a horrific craft, developing techniques and signature moves with each attempt. You find yourself standing in that narrow space behind the fence, trying to understand how someone could work so efficiently in such cramped quarters while maintaining the presence of mind to arrange evidence and personal belongings. The logistics alone seem impossible, but here's the evidence documented in careful Victorian handwriting and preserved in police files that read like pages from a nightmare. Historians still debate whether the progression from Mary Ann Nichols to Annie Chapman represents learning behavior on the killer's part, or whether Annie's more extensive injuries simply reflect having more time and privacy to work. The truth probably involves elements of both: a killer growing more confident and a crime scene that offered slightly more opportunity for the kind of meticulous horror that was becoming his signature. The neighborhood's reaction to Annie Chapman's murder is noticeably different from their response to Mary Ann Nichols's death. Where the first murder generated concern and speculation, the second creates genuine panic. People begin walking in groups, avoiding dark alleys and eyeing strangers with suspicion that borders on paranoia. The police increase their patrols, but you can see in their faces that they're beginning to realize they're dealing with something beyond their experience. As you prepare to leave Hanbury Street, you're struck by how the morning fog seems to muffle even the sounds of the growing crowd. It's as if the weather itself is conspiring to create the perfect atmosphere for secrets and horror, wrapping the neighborhood in a blanket of gray that makes everything feel muted and uncertain. You can't help but wonder if the killer chose foggy mornings for practical reasons, or if there was something about the atmosphere itself that appealed to whatever dark impulses drove him to transform ordinary London streets into scenes from a Gothic novel. The sun struggles to penetrate the mist, casting everything in that particular Victorian twilight that makes even daylight feel somehow ominous. As you walk away from number 29 Hanbury Street, you carry with you the knowledge that this was where the pattern truly began, where a single murder became a series, where Jack the Ripper transformed from unknown killer to the monster who would define an era. You're walking through the streets of Whitechapel on September 30th, 1888, and the air itself seems to vibrate with tension, as if the very molecules are holding their breath. It's been 3 weeks since Annie Chapman's body was discovered in Hanbury Street, 3 weeks of increased police patrols and nervous glances at shadows, and tonight the fog rolls in thick as Victorian morality and twice as suffocating. The gas lamps struggle against the mist like elderly gentlemen trying to light their pipes in a windstorm, determined but ultimately ineffective. You can hear your own footsteps echoing off the wet cobblestones, creating a rhythm that seems to sync with your heartbeat and the distant sound of horse hooves on stone. Somewhere in this maze of narrow streets and darker alleys, 2 women are about to become part of history, in ways they never could have imagined when they woke up this morning. Elizabeth Stride, long Liz to her friends, moves through the evening with the kind of careful optimism that comes from surviving 45 years of disappointment without losing the ability to hope for better luck tomorrow. She's been drinking at the Queen's Head on Fashion Street, where the gin is cheap and the company cheaper, but where a woman can sit by the fire and pretend for a few hours that life hasn't been one long series of unfortunate events, punctuated by brief moments of almost happiness. You follow her as she makes her way toward Berner Street, where the International Working Men's Educational Club provides a beacon of warm light and political conversation that must seem almost exotic compared to the usual Whitechapel evening entertainment of avoiding starvation and dodging creditors. The fog swirls around her dark skirt as she walks, and you notice how she keeps to the better-lit areas, a woman who's learned that in Whitechapel, visibility can be the difference between making it home and becoming another unfortunate statistic. The mainstream historical fact that everyone knows is that Elizabeth Stride was the 3rd canonical victim of Jack the Ripper, killed on what became known as the double event night. But here's what they don't tell you. Liz was a survivor in ways that go beyond simply making it through each day. She'd emigrated from Sweden, worked as a domestic servant, survived the sinking of the Princess Alice steamboat in 1878, a disaster that killed over 600 people, and had been supporting herself through a combination of charwoman work and whatever other opportunities presented themselves. At approximately 12:45 a.m., Louis Diemschutz returns to the club driving his pony and cart, probably thinking about nothing more dramatic than getting his horse settled for the night and perhaps having one last drink before heading home. His pony shies at something in the darkness of Dutfield's yard, and when Diemschutz investigates with a match, because even in 1888, the solution to mysterious shadows was apparently, let's get a closer look. He discovers Elizabeth Stride lying on her side, her throat cut but her body otherwise undisturbed. This is where things get interesting, and by interesting you understand, we mean the kind of fascinating that makes you glad you're experiencing this through the safety of historical distance rather than stumbling across it yourself in a foggy Victorian alley. Unlike Mary Ann Nichols and Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride shows no signs of abdominal mutilation. Her throat has been cut, certainly, but the signature post-mortem arrangements that characterize the previous murders are completely absent. Here's a curiosity that most people don't know. Elizabeth Stride was found still clutching a packet of cashews, breath-freshening lozenges, in her left hand. The packet was unopened, suggesting that whatever happened to her occurred so quickly that she didn't have time to drop what she was holding. This detail becomes crucial to understanding the timeline and the circumstances of her death, because it suggests either incredible speed on the killer's part or circumstances that were different from what had become his established pattern. The scene in Dutfield's yard creates immediate controversy among the investigating officers. Dr. Frederick Blackwell, who examines the body, notes that the single cut to Elizabeth's throat was made from left to right, consistent with the previous murders. But the absence of additional mutilation raises questions that the police are hesitant to voice publicly, but can't ignore privately. You can almost see the wheels turning in the investigators' minds as they try to reconcile what they're seeing with what they've come to expect from their unknown killer. The positioning is wrong. Elizabeth lies on her side rather than on her back. The mutilation is incomplete by the standards set by the previous crimes. The location, while secluded, is also immediately adjacent to a building full of people who might have heard something if given enough time. Historians still debate whether Elizabeth Stride was actually a victim of Jack the Ripper, or whether her death was the result of domestic violence or a separate criminal who happened to choose an unfortunate night to commit murder in Whitechapel. The timing and location certainly fit the pattern, but the differences in methodology raise questions that have never been satisfactorily answered. The theory that develops among investigators is that the killer was interrupted in his work, that Louis Diemschutz's return to the club occurred just as the murder was taking place, forcing the perpetrator to flee before he could complete his usual post-mortem activities. This would explain the unusual characteristics of Elizabeth's death, while maintaining the connection to the ongoing series of murders. But here's where the night takes a turn from merely disturbing to absolutely remarkable in its horror. If the killer was indeed interrupted at Dutfield's yard, he didn't go home frustrated. Instead, he apparently decided that one incomplete murder was no way to end an evening, and within 45 minutes, Catherine Eddowes would be found in Mitre Square, subjected to mutilations that exceeded anything seen in the previous crimes. The idea that someone could commit one murder, be interrupted, and then immediately set about committing another speaks to a level of determination and cold-bloodedness that makes your Victorian fog seem downright cozy by comparison. It's like discovering that your worst nightmare has a backup plan, complete with alternate routes and contingency strategies. As you stand in the misty darkness of Dutfield's yard, listening to the distant sounds of the club members discussing politics and social reform, you're struck by the juxtaposition of idealism and horror. Just feet from where men debate the perfectibility of human society, someone has demonstrated humanity's capacity for calculated evil with surgical precision and theatrical flair. The fog continues to swirl around your feet, muffling the sounds of the investigation and creating an atmosphere that feels suspended between reality and nightmare. You find yourself wondering about those crucial moments when Diemschutz's cart turned into the yard, whether the killer was still there, crouched in the shadows, listening to the horse's hooves approach. Whether he slipped away into the mist with the kind of casual confidence that suggests this wasn't his first time making a quick exit from a crime scene. Elizabeth Stride's story becomes a question mark in the larger narrative of Jack the Ripper, a reminder that even in cases that seem to follow clear patterns, reality has a way of introducing complications that resist easy categorization. As you prepare to leave Dutfield's yard, you carry with you the knowledge that this night is only half over, and that the fog conceals secrets that will only become more disturbing as the hours pass. You're moving through the fog-shrouded streets toward Mitre Square now, and the mist clings to your coat like secrets that refuse to stay buried. It's still September 30th, 1888, and you're about to witness the second act of what history will remember as the double event. A night when Jack the Ripper apparently decided that one murder was merely an appetizer, and the main course required considerably more theatrical flair. The clock tower chimes 1:30 a.m. as you approach the square, a small enclosed area surrounded by warehouses and offices that during daylight hours bustles with commercial activity, but now sits empty as a politician's promise. The gas lamp in the center casts its usual anemic circle of yellow light, creating shadows that seem to dance with their own malevolent purpose. You can't help but think that Victorian urban planning had a real talent for creating spaces that looked perfectly respectable during business hours, but transformed into Gothic horror sets the moment the sun went down. Catherine Eddowes moves through the darkness with the careful navigation of someone who's learned that sobriety and steady employment are luxuries, but maintaining dignity is a choice available to everyone regardless of circumstances. At 46, she's been arrested earlier this evening for drunk and disorderly conduct, a charge that probably deserves some kind of award for understatement, given that she was found imitating a fire engine in the middle of Aldgate High Street. You watch her as she's released from Bishopsgate Police Station at 1 a.m., having sobered up enough to convince the duty sergeant that she's capable of making her way home without further theatrical interpretations of emergency vehicles. She gives her name as Mary Ann Kelly when she leaves, either because she's still slightly confused about her own identity, or because she's developed the kind of strategic relationship with truth that comes from navigating poverty in a society that judges first and asks questions later. The mainstream historical fact that everyone knows is that Catherine Eddowes became the second victim of the double event, murdered just 45 minutes after Elizabeth Stride was found in Dutfield's yard. But here's what doesn't make it into the dramatic retellings. Catherine was an educated woman who could read and write, someone who had lived with a man named John Kelly for 7 years, in what appears to have been a genuinely affectionate relationship, and who had recently returned to London after working in the hop fields of Kent, where seasonal agricultural work provided temporary escape from urban poverty. As Catherine makes her way through the narrow streets toward Mitre Square, you're struck by the ordinariness of her movements. She's not creeping through shadows or moving with the exaggerated caution of someone who knows she's about to become a historical footnote. She's simply walking home, probably thinking about finding John Kelly and getting some sleep before facing whatever tomorrow might bring. It's the kind of mundane human moment that makes what's about to happen feel even more surreal. PC Edward Watkins completes his patrol of Mitre Square at 1:30 a.m., noting nothing unusual except the persistent fog and the way his footsteps seem to echo off the surrounding buildings with unusual clarity. Police beats in 1888 were timed with the precision of a Swiss watch. Every constable knew exactly where he should be at any given moment, which means that whoever is about to use Mitre Square as a stage for horror has approximately 14 minutes before the next patrol arrives. Here's a curiosity that most people don't know. Mitre Square was actually one of the better lit areas in Whitechapel, with not just the central gas lamp, but also illumination from surrounding buildings. The killer chose to commit his most elaborate crime not in the darkest, most secluded location available, but in a relatively well-lit, semi-public space that required both incredible audacity and precise timing. It's like deciding to perform surgery in a theater lobby during intermission. Technically possible, but requiring a level of confidence that borders on the supernatural. When P.C. Watkins returns at 1:44 a.m., he discovers Catherine Eddowes lying in the southwest corner of the square, and what he sees makes Elizabeth Stride's murder look almost restrained by comparison. Catherine's throat has been cut with the now familiar deep efficiency, but the post-mortem mutilations go far beyond anything seen in the previous crimes. The killer has performed what can only be described as a grotesque anatomical demonstration, removing organs with a precision that suggests either medical knowledge or considerable practice in this particular hobby. You find yourself standing in that corner of Mitre Square, trying to comprehend the logistics of what happened here. In 14 minutes, the time it takes to brew a pot of tea or read a few pages of a book, someone committed murder, performed extensive mutilations, arranged the scene, and disappeared into the fog without leaving behind any useful evidence. It's the kind of efficiency that would be impressive if it weren't so thoroughly horrifying. The investigation reveals details that transform this from a murder into something approaching performance art, albeit the kind that would get you immediately expelled from any respectable art academy. Catherine's possessions have been arranged with the same ritualistic precision seen at previous crime scenes, but with additions that suggest the killer is becoming more elaborate in his staging. A piece of her apron has been cut away and will later be found in Goulston Street, with what may or may not be a message written in chalk above it. Dr. Frederick Gordon Brown's examination of Catherine's body reveals the most extensive mutilations yet documented in the series. The precision of the cuts, particularly those involving organ removal, reignites debates about whether the killer possesses medical training or simply the kind of anatomical enthusiasm that comes from repeated practice. It's like watching someone perfect a horrific craft, developing signature techniques and artistic flourishes with each performance. Historians still debate whether the double event represents escalation in the killer's behavior, or whether the interrupted nature of Elizabeth Stride's murder simply left him with unfinished business that demanded completion. The timeline certainly supports the theory that one killer committed both murders, but the differences in methodology and location raise questions about motivation, planning, and the psychological state of someone capable of such rapid adaptation. The neighborhood's response to the double event marks a turning point in public perception of the Whitechapel murders. Where previous crimes generated concern and increased caution, the idea that someone could commit two murders in one night, in different locations with such elaborate methodology, creates a level of panic that borders on mass hysteria. People begin to speak of the killer not as a man, but as something supernatural, something that moves through the fog like a demon with surgical training and theatrical pretensions. As you prepare to leave Mitre Square, you're struck by how the fog seems to muffle even your own thoughts, creating a kind of acoustic isolation that makes the entire scene feel suspended outside of normal time and space. The gas lamp continues its flickering vigil, casting the same weak circle of light that witnessed horrors its Victorian engineers never could have imagined when they designed these streets for commerce and respectable evening strolls. The morning light will eventually burn through the mist, and Mitre Square will return to its daytime identity as a perfectly ordinary commercial space. But you carry with you the knowledge that this corner of London has been transformed into something else entirely. A stage where someone performed the most elaborate and disturbing piece of theater in criminal history, using the fog as a curtain and the darkness as an accomplice. You're standing at the entrance to Miller's Court now, and the narrow passageway feels like stepping into the throat of something that's been waiting to swallow you whole. It's November 9th, 1888, and the fog has returned with the persistence of a Victorian debt collector, thick, suffocating, and absolutely determined to make everyone's life considerably more unpleasant than it needs to be. The court itself is barely wide enough for two people to pass without engaging in the kind of awkward sideways shuffle that makes everyone involved question their life choices. 13 small rooms open off this cramped space, each one housing someone who's made peace with the fact that privacy is a luxury reserved for people with considerably better financial planning skills. You can hear the sounds of life echoing off the brick walls, muffled conversations, the creak of floorboards, and the occasional cough that speaks to the kind of respiratory challenges that come from breathing air that's been recycled through too many lungs for too many years. Room 13 sits at the end of the court, its single window facing the brick wall of the neighboring building, with all the optimism of a Victorian marriage proposal. Technically present, but not offering much in the way of pleasant prospects. Mary Jane Kelly has been living here for several months, paying her rent when she can and negotiating extensions when she can't, in the kind of arrangement that requires diplomatic skills that would impress seasoned ambassadors. At 25, Mary Jane represents something of an anomaly among the Ripper's victims. She's younger, reportedly more attractive, and Irish rather than English, with the accent that carries hints of the countryside rather than the grinding urban desperation that characterizes most of Whitechapel. She's been seen around the neighborhood singing, which in 1888 Whitechapel was either a sign of remarkable optimism or early-stage mental breakdown, and honestly, those two things weren't always easy to distinguish. The mainstream historical fact that everyone knows is that Mary Jane Kelly was the fifth and final canonical victim of Jack the Ripper, and that her murder was by far the most extensive and horrific of the series. But here's what they don't tell you in the sensationalized accounts. Mary Jane was literate, something of a rarity among the working poor of Whitechapel, and had reportedly lived in France for a time, suggesting a level of worldliness that set her apart from the other victims. She also appears to have been genuinely well liked by her neighbors, which in a place where survival often required looking out for yourself first, speaks to a personality that retained kindness despite circumstances that would have justified considerable cynicism. Thomas Bowyer, sent by landlord John McCarthy to collect the overdue rent that's been accumulating like Victorian social problems, gradually, then suddenly, approaches room 13 at 10:45 a.m. on November 9th. He knocks on the door with the kind of persistence that comes from having to collect debts from people who have elevated creative excuse-making to an art form, but receives no response beyond the kind of silence that makes you wonder if the tenant has developed either selective hearing or an escape tunnel. When Bowyer tries the door handle, he discovers it's locked, which in itself isn't unusual. Privacy being one of the few commodities that people could still control, regardless of their financial circumstances. But the broken window pane provides an alternative means of investigation, and when Bowyer peers through the gap, what he sees transforms him from a rent collector into the discoverer of what will become the most documented crime scene in Victorian history. You watch as Bowyer's face changes, processing information that his mind struggles to categorize. Through that broken window, Mary Jane Kelly's room has been transformed into something that exceeds the boundaries of murder and enters territory that Victorian sensibilities lack adequate vocabulary to describe. The scene inside suggests that the killer didn't just visit room 13. He took up temporary residence, working with the kind of methodical thoroughness that speaks to having considerable time, privacy, and an artistic vision that would make Dante reconsider his descriptions of hell. Here's a curiosity that most people don't know. Mary Jane Kelly's murder took place indoors, behind a locked door, in a space that provided complete privacy for extended periods of time. Unlike the previous murders, which were committed in semi-public locations with time constraints, this crime scene represents what happens when Jack the Ripper is given unlimited time and complete seclusion to express whatever dark impulses had been driving his previous, more hurried work. The investigation reveals that Mary Jane was last seen alive around 2 a.m. on November 9th, reportedly singing "The Violet Plucked from Mother's Grave," a song choice that seems almost prophetically appropriate, though you suspect that irony was the last thing on her mind as she prepared for what she expected to be an ordinary night's work. Witnesses reported hearing a cry of "murder" around 3:45 a.m., but in Whitechapel, such exclamations were common enough that they barely rated a glance toward the window, let alone actual investigation. Dr. Thomas Bond's examination of the crime scene reveals mutilation so extensive that positive identification becomes challenging. The killer appears to have used Mary Jane's room as a workshop, taking time to explore techniques and methods that had only been hinted at in the previous crimes. It's as if someone had been practicing for months and finally found the perfect opportunity to demonstrate their full capabilities. The logistics of the crime are particularly disturbing when you consider the acoustic environment of Miller's Court. The walls are thin enough that normal conversation can be heard between rooms, yet whatever happened in room 13 occurred without raising enough alarm to bring immediate investigation. This suggests either incredible efficiency on the killer's part or methods that were designed to minimize noise while maximizing the kind of post-mortem activities that characterize his signature work. Historians still debate whether Mary Jane Kelly's murder represents the culmination of Jack the Ripper's career or simply the crime that provided him with enough satisfaction to retire from active killing. The extensive nature of the mutilations could suggest either a killer reaching the peak of his destructive capabilities or someone who finally had the opportunity to fully express impulses that had been constrained by time and location in previous crimes. The room itself becomes a character in the investigation, a space that contained not just a murder, but what appears to have been a prolonged session of anatomical exploration, conducted with the kind of scientific curiosity that would have been admirable if applied to literally any other subject. The killer appears to have arranged Mary Jane's organs with the same ritualistic precision seen at previous crime scenes, but with elaborations that suggest someone working without time constraints for the first time. As you stand in Miller's Court, surrounded by the sounds of daily life continuing in the adjacent rooms, you're struck by the proximity of ordinary human existence to extraordinary horror. Families are preparing breakfast. Children are getting ready for whatever passes for education when your parents can't afford school fees, and neighbors are discussing the weather and the rising cost of bread, all within feet of a crime scene that redefined the boundaries of human evil. The fog continues to swirl through the narrow court, muffling sounds and creating an atmosphere that feels suspended between reality and nightmare. You find yourself wondering about those hours between 2 a.m. and dawn, when someone used Mary Jane Kelly's room to compose what would become the final movement in his symphony of horror. Whether he left satisfied, or whether this was simply where the historical record loses track of someone who moved on to other hunting grounds in other cities. Mary Jane Kelly's murder marks the end of the canonical Jack the Ripper crimes. But whether this represents a killer who achieved whatever goal he'd set for himself, or simply someone who decided that after Miller's Court, anything else would be anticlimactic, remains one of the many questions that this case refuses to answer clearly. You find yourself sifting through stacks of correspondence that seem to multiply like Victorian social problems, gradually at first, then with alarming persistence. The Metropolitan Police Evidence Room in 1888 resembles nothing so much as a literary society gone completely mad, except instead of debating the merits of Tennyson, they're trying to determine which of hundreds of letters claiming to be from Jack the Ripper might actually contain genuine clues, rather than the fevered imagination of someone with too much time and insufficient hobbies. The paper feels rough beneath your fingertips, that particular texture of cheap Victorian stationery that suggests its authors weren't exactly shopping at Harrods for their writing supplies. Each envelope bears the unmistakable signs of having passed through multiple hands. Postal workers, police officers, newspaper editors, all of whom probably wished they'd chosen careers with less exposure to the creative writing efforts of disturbed individuals. The first letter that catches your attention arrives at the Central News Agency on September 27, 1888, written in what the handwriting experts of the time describe as an educated hand, though you can't help but think that the content suggests the writer's education may have focused more on creative penmanship than critical thinking skills. The letter begins with the now famous greeting, "Dear Boss," displaying the kind of casual familiarity that suggests either remarkable confidence or complete detachment from social norms. You read the text with the kind of fascination usually reserved for watching someone else's particularly dramatic family arguments. Horrifying, but impossible to look away from. The writer claims responsibility for the Whitechapel murders and promises to clip the lady's ears off in future crimes, demonstrating either prophetic abilities or inside knowledge that makes the investigating officers considerably more interested in this particular piece of correspondence than the usual collection of confessions from people claiming to be Napoleon, Jesus, or both. The mainstream historical fact that everyone knows is that hundreds of letters claiming to be from Jack the Ripper were sent to police and newspapers during the investigation. But here's what doesn't make it into most accounts. The Victorian postal system was so efficient that these letters often arrived the same day they were written, creating a kind of real-time psychological warfare between the killer, or killers, or attention-seeking hoaxers, and the authorities trying to solve the case. The Dear Boss letter introduces the name Jack the Ripper to the world, a moniker that sounds more like a character from a penny dreadful than a real serial killer, which perhaps explains why it caught the public imagination so thoroughly. The author demonstrates a flair for dramatic writing that suggests either genuine psychopathy or a background in theatrical promotion. And honestly, in Victorian London, those two career paths weren't always mutually exclusive. 3 days after the letter's publication, Catherine Eddowes is found murdered in Mitre Square, and investigators discover that her right ear has indeed been partially cut away, exactly as promised in the Dear Boss letter. This detail transforms the correspondence from interesting curiosity to potential evidence, though it also raises the question of whether the killer was fulfilling his own prophecy, or whether someone had simply read the newspaper and decided to provide the expected evidence. Here's a curiosity that most people don't know. The Dear Boss letter was initially dismissed by police as a hoax and was only published in newspapers as a way to generate public interest and potentially prompt genuine witnesses to come forward. The fact that its predictions proved accurate was either remarkable coincidence, inside knowledge, or evidence that the relationship between the media and the killer was more complex than anyone wanted to admit. The second significant piece of correspondence arrives on October 1st, postmarked just hours after the double event. The Saucy Jackie postcard, written in the same hand as the Dear Boss letter, gleefully reports that the joke about leather apron gave me real fits, referring to the early suspect John Pizer, whose nickname had become associated with the case. The writer claims credit for the double event and promises more work to come, displaying the kind of casual attitude toward murder that makes you grateful for the historical distance between yourself and whoever was feeding letters into the Victorian postal system. You examine the handwriting with the intensity of someone trying to decode ancient hieroglyphics, looking for clues that might reveal whether these letters represent genuine communication from the killer or elaborate hoaxes created by someone with access to crime scene details and a disturbing sense of humor. The penmanship is consistent between letters, suggesting either a single author or someone with remarkable dedication to maintaining a fictional persona. The investigation into the Ripper letters reveals the challenges of conducting criminal investigations in an era before modern forensic techniques. Police officers examine handwriting with magnifying glasses, compare ink samples by lamplight, and attempt to trace paper sources through methods that would make modern investigators weep with frustration. It's like trying to solve a crossword puzzle using only a quill pen and good intentions. Technically possible, but requiring levels of patience that border on the superhuman. Historians still debate whether any of the hundreds of Ripper letters were genuine communications from the killer, or whether they were all elaborate hoaxes that capitalized on public fascination with the case. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. A few authentic pieces of correspondence buried among a mountain of attention-seeking fiction that demonstrates the Victorian era's remarkable capacity for creative writing when properly motivated by morbid curiosity. The letters also reveal the extent to which the Jack the Ripper case had captured public imagination beyond the boundaries of Whitechapel. Correspondence arrives from across Britain, and even internationally, suggesting that news of the murders had spread far beyond London and inspired a kind of macabre tourist interest in participating in the investigation, even from a distance. Some letters contain details that could only have been known by someone with access to crime scene information, descriptions of injuries, positioning of bodies, and other specifics that hadn't been released to the public. These pieces of correspondence become crucial evidence in the investigation, though they also raise uncomfortable questions about how widely crime scene information was circulating among police officers, medical personnel, and newspaper reporters. The psychological profile that emerges from the letters suggests someone with education, familiarity with current events, and a theatrical sensibility that enjoys taunting authority figures. Whether this represents the actual killer, or simply someone who found the murders an interesting hook for creative writing exercises, remains one of the many unresolved questions in the case. You find yourself wondering about the postal workers who handled these letters, the newspaper editors who decided which ones to publish, and the police officers who had to read through hundreds of pieces of correspondence that ranged from genuinely helpful tips to elaborately detailed confessions from people who clearly hadn't left their sitting rooms in years. The administrative burden of processing all this communication must have been staggering, like trying to find useful information in the comments section of a Victorian-era internet forum. As you finish examining the correspondence files, you're struck by how the letters transformed the Jack the Ripper case from a series of local murders into a kind of interactive media experience that invited public participation in unprecedented ways. The killer, or killers, or hoaxers, had essentially created the first modern media manipulation campaign, using the postal system to maintain public interest and police frustration with the efficiency that would impress modern publicists. The fog continues to swirl outside the police station windows, and you can't help but think that somewhere in that mist, someone might be composing another letter, another piece of the puzzle that will either illuminate the truth or add another layer of confusion to a case that seems designed to resist easy solutions. You're walking alongside Detective Inspector Abberline as he makes his way through the fog-shrouded streets of Whitechapel, and you can practically hear the gears of Victorian bureaucracy grinding against the reality of a case that refuses to follow the neat procedural guidelines they teach at Scotland Yard. His boots echo against the wet cobblestones with the rhythm of someone who's discovered that actual police work bears about as much resemblance to theoretical police work as a penny dreadful does to real life, which is to say, not very much at all. The gas lamps flicker with their usual commitment to being just helpful enough to make you think you can see what's happening, but not quite bright enough to actually accomplish that goal. It's rather like Victorian detective work itself, earnest, well-intentioned, and operating with tools that are just slightly inadequate for the job at hand. You can smell the coal smoke mixing with fog to create that particular London atmosphere that makes everything feel like it's been filtered through a dirty sock. Abberline carries himself with the weary dignity of a man who's realized that his career has taken an unexpected turn into territory that wasn't covered in any of his training manuals. At 45, he's experienced enough to know that most crimes follow predictable patterns. Domestic disputes that turn violent, robberies gone wrong, the occasional fraud scheme that requires more paperwork than actual detective work. But Jack the Ripper represents something entirely new in his professional experience, like trying to arrest a ghost with delusions of grandeur and a medical degree. The mainstream historical fact that everyone knows is that the Metropolitan Police investigation into the Jack the Ripper murders was hampered by primitive forensic techniques and jurisdictional conflicts. But here's what they don't tell you in the textbooks. The police were also dealing with unprecedented media attention, political pressure from multiple government departments, and a level of public hysteria that made conducting normal investigative work about as feasible as hosting a tea party during an earthquake. You follow Abberline as he examines the crime scene at Miller's Court, watching him take notes in the careful copperplate handwriting that suggests a man who learned penmanship when such things mattered for professional advancement. He measures distances with a tape measure, sketches the scene in a notebook that looks more suited to recording grocery lists than documenting historical atrocities, and interviews witnesses with the kind of methodical thoroughness that modern investigators would recognize, even if they might question some of the techniques. The investigation reveals the limitations of 1888 police work in ways that are almost endearing in their earnestness. Officers dust for fingerprints using methods that wouldn't be formally developed for another decade. Attempt to preserve crime scenes without understanding the principles of evidence contamination. And try to establish timelines using witness testimony from people whose relationship with sobriety is, shall we say, somewhat casual. Here's a curiosity that most people don't know. The Jack the Ripper investigation was actually quite advanced for its time, incorporating early versions of techniques that would later become standard police procedure. Abberline and his team used crime scene photography, detailed autopsy reports, and systematic witness interviews, innovations that put them ahead of most contemporary police investigations, even if they seem primitive by modern standards. The jurisdictional complications alone are enough to give anyone a headache that no amount of Victorian patent medicine could cure. The murders occur across the boundaries of multiple police divisions: Metropolitan Police, City of London Police, and various local authorities who all have opinions about proper procedure, and none of whom are particularly interested in cooperation. It's like trying to conduct an orchestra where every musician is playing from a different sheet of music, and half of them are convinced they should be conducting instead. You watch as Abberline attempts to coordinate between these various agencies, managing personalities and procedures with the diplomatic skills of someone negotiating a treaty between warring nations. The paperwork alone must be staggering. Reports filed in triplicate, witness statements cross-referenced, evidence logs maintained according to different departmental standards that occasionally contradict each other in ways that would make Kafka proud. The political pressure adds another layer of complexity that transforms the investigation from criminal case into public relations nightmare. Home Secretary Henry Matthews receives daily inquiries from Parliament about progress in the case. Queen Victoria herself expresses concern about the safety of her subjects, and newspaper editors demand regular updates on an investigation that frankly isn't producing the kind of dramatic breakthroughs that make for compelling headlines. Historians still debate whether the police investigation was genuinely hindered by primitive techniques, or whether the real problem was the unprecedented nature of serial killing, which didn't fit into existing categories of criminal behavior. The truth probably involves both factors: investigators trying to solve a completely new type of crime using methods designed for more conventional criminal activity. The house-to-house searches reveal the social complexity of investigating crime in Whitechapel, where residents have complicated relationships with authority figures, and information sharing requires negotiations that would challenge experienced diplomats. Police officers knock on doors in buildings where half the residents are technically trespassing, question witnesses whose legal status is questionable, and attempt to establish alibis for people whose daily activities exist largely outside the boundaries of official record-keeping. You're struck by how the investigation becomes a kind of sociological survey of Victorian poverty, documenting living conditions, employment patterns, and social relationships that might otherwise have remained invisible to official scrutiny. Police reports read like ethnographic studies, describing a world that exists parallel to respectable London, but operates according to different rules and different definitions of normal behavior. The evidence collection process reveals both the ambition and the limitations of Victorian scientific method. Police officers attempt to preserve biological evidence using techniques that amount to careful description and hopeful preservation. Analyze handwriting samples with magnifying glasses and comparative patience, and try to establish criminal patterns using methods that rely more on intuition than systematic analysis. Abberline's personal notes preserved in police archives show the psychological toll of investigating crimes that exceed the boundaries of normal human experience. His handwriting becomes less precise as the investigation progresses, his reports more detailed in ways that suggest someone trying to make sense of senseless events through the sheer accumulation of facts and observations. The investigation also reveals the extent to which the Jack the Ripper case had become a kind of public entertainment, with amateur detectives offering theories, private citizens conducting their own surveillance, and vigilante groups organizing patrols that probably created more problems than they solved. Police officers found themselves managing not just a criminal investigation, but a media circus that attracted attention from across Britain and internationally. As you walk with Abberline through the fog-shrouded streets, you can almost feel the weight of expectations pressing down on him like a heavy Victorian overcoat. The public wants answers, the government wants results, and the press wants stories, but the evidence refuses to cooperate with anyone's timeline or dramatic preferences. The fog swirls around your feet, muffling the sounds of the investigation, and creating an atmosphere that seems designed to frustrate even the most determined detective work. You find yourself wondering about the conversations Abberline must have had with his wife when he returned home each evening, trying to explain why the most famous case of his career remained as mysterious as the fog that seemed to follow him through every crime scene. You're standing in a dimly lit room that feels like the waiting area for history's most exclusive and disturbing club, where the membership requirements include having been suspected of being Jack the Ripper at some point between 1888 and the present day. The walls seem to close in as you contemplate the parade of individuals who have been dragged into this particular spotlight, each carrying their own collection of circumstantial evidence, suspicious behavior, and the kind of personal quirks that make Victorian neighbors reach for their curtains and start taking detailed notes. The gas lamp flickers with the consistency of a politician's promises, casting dancing shadows that seem almost appropriate for a rogues gallery that reads like the guest list for the world's most uncomfortable dinner party. You can smell the mustiness of old paper and older accusations, the particular atmosphere that comes from decades of speculation, mixed with just enough evidence to keep everyone arguing, but not enough to actually solve anything. Walter Sickert stands in the corner like a particularly gloomy piece of his own artwork, his painter's eye taking in details that others might miss, and his artistic temperament providing exactly the kind of brooding intensity that makes people wonder if creativity and homicidal tendencies might be more closely related than anyone feels comfortable discussing. At 38 during the murders, he possessed both the artistic skill to appreciate the theatrical elements of the crimes and the kind of bohemian lifestyle that made respectable Victorians deeply suspicious of his moral character. The mainstream historical fact that everyone knows is that dozens of suspects have been proposed for the Jack the Ripper murders, ranging from local residents to members of the royal family. But here's what they don't tell you in the dramatic documentaries. Most of these suspects were identified decades after the murders, when the people involved were conveniently dead, and therefore unable to defend themselves against accusations that would have resulted in libel suits if made during their lifetimes. You turn your attention to Montague John Druitt, whose presence here feels less like that of a potential serial killer, and more like someone who wandered into the wrong historical narrative entirely. A barrister and part-time schoolteacher who suffered from depression and ultimately took his own life in the Thames, Druitt represents the kind of tragic figure that Victorian society preferred to forget rather than understand. His legal training would have provided familiarity with anatomical evidence, but his documented mental state suggests someone more likely to harm himself than others, though admittedly, logic hasn't always been the strongest element in Ripper suspect identification. The investigation files reveal a fascinating collection of individuals who managed to attract suspicion through a combination of unfortunate timing, unusual behavior, and the kind of personal eccentricities that made Victorian neighbors regard them with the sort of watchful concern usually reserved for people who talk to their cats in public. Some were mentally ill, some were foreigners, and some simply had the misfortune to be in the wrong place at the wrong time while displaying insufficient amounts of conventional social behavior. Here's a curiosity that most people don't know. Many of the most famous Jack the Ripper suspects weren't identified until the 1960s, and later, when amateur investigators began combing through historical records with the benefit of hindsight and the luxury of not having to worry about evidence standards that would hold up in court. It's rather like solving a crossword puzzle when someone has already filled in half the answers, significantly easier, but not necessarily more accurate. Aaron Kosminski shuffles through the shadows like someone who's become accustomed to being stared at, for all the wrong reasons. a Polish immigrant whose mental illness made him a convenient target for xenophobic suspicions. Kosminski spent years in asylums while investigators debated whether his documented delusions included homicidal tendencies or simply the kind of paranoid fantasies that unfortunately characterized many Victorian approaches to mental health treatment. You're struck by how many of the suspects seem to have been chosen less for compelling evidence and more for their availability as convenient scapegoats for fears that extended far beyond the specific crimes. Foreigners, artists, the mentally ill, and anyone whose lifestyle didn't conform to respectable Victorian standards found themselves subjected to scrutiny that revealed more about social prejudices than criminal behavior. The royal conspiracy theories introduce an element that transforms the case from criminal investigation into elaborate political thriller, complete with Masonic cover-ups, royal scandals, and the kind of intricate plotting that would make Victorian novelists envious of the complexity. Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence, becomes a suspect not because of compelling evidence, but because royal involvement would elevate the murders from mere criminal activity to affairs of state requiring elaborate cover-ups. Historians still debate whether any of the proposed suspects represent genuine possibilities, or whether the entire exercise of suspect identification has become a kind of historical parlor game that reveals more about the investigators than the investigated. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. A few individuals who might have had genuine connections to the crimes, buried among dozens of theories that say more about human psychology than criminal behavior. The medical suspects present particularly intriguing possibilities, given the apparent anatomical knowledge displayed in some of the murders. Dr. Francis Tumblety, an American quack doctor with a collection of preserved uteri and a talent for attracting police attention, represents the kind of character who seems almost too perfectly suspicious to be genuine. His arrest in connection with the murders and subsequent flight to America creates a compelling narrative, though one that depends more on dramatic timing than solid evidence. You find yourself wondering about the psychological profiles that emerge from this collection of suspects. What common characteristics, if any, might link individuals who could conceive and execute such crimes? The diversity of proposed candidates suggests either that the killer was remarkably skilled at avoiding detection, or that the evidence is ambiguous enough to support almost any theory with sufficient creativity. The class dynamics revealed in suspect identification are particularly telling, showing how social position influenced both suspicion and investigation. Working-class suspects faced immediate scrutiny for minor behavioral anomalies, while upper-class possibilities required considerably more evidence before serious investigation began. It's rather like a criminal justice system designed by people who believed that moral character could be determined by postal address and quality of haberdashery. Local suspects like George Chapman and Frederick Deeming bring the investigation back to the streets of Whitechapel, where familiarity with the area and knowledge of local patterns might have provided practical advantages for someone planning elaborate crimes. But their documented criminal careers in other areas raise questions about whether Jack the Ripper was a specialist killer, or simply someone whose broader criminal activities happen to include these particular murders. As you survey this collection of possibilities, you're struck by how the search for Jack the Ripper's identity has become almost as fascinating as the original crimes, creating its own folklore and generating theories that reflect the concerns and prejudices of each generation of investigators. The fog swirls through the room, obscuring details and creating the kind of atmospheric uncertainty that seems appropriate for a case that has resisted definitive solutions for more than a century. The suspects stand in their shadowy corners like figures in a wax museum devoted to historical mysteries, each carrying their own collection of circumstantial evidence and personal tragedies that made them convenient targets for speculation. You can't help but wonder whether the real Jack the Ripper is among them, or whether he remains safely anonymous, protected by the same fog that concealed his crimes and continues to obscure the truth about Victorian London's most notorious resident. You're standing in Dr. Thomas Bond's examination room, where the air smells of carbolic acid and the kind of professional determination that comes from approaching the unthinkable with scientific methodology. The gas lamps cast a steady yellow glow over examination tables that have seen more than their share of human tragedy, and you can hear the soft scratch of pen on paper as careful observations are recorded in the precise handwriting that Victorian medical training demanded. Dr. Y. Bond moves around the examination table with the measured precision of someone who's learned to treat human remains as puzzles to be solved, rather than people who once laughed at inappropriate jokes and worried about paying rent. His sleeves are rolled up, his hands steady, and his expression carries that particular professional detachment that allows medical men to function in circumstances that would send most people running for the nearest gin palace. The question that hangs in the air like London fog is whether Jack the Ripper possessed genuine medical knowledge, or simply the kind of enthusiasm for anatomical exploration that comes from considerable practice and a complete absence of normal human squeamishness. It's rather like trying to determine whether someone is a trained chef or just really good at following recipes. The results might look similar, but the underlying knowledge tells a very different story. You examine the autopsy reports spread across Dr. Bond's desk, each one documenting injuries with the kind of clinical precision that transforms horror into medical data. The handwriting is careful, the terminology exact, and the conclusions drawn with the measured caution of someone who understands that speculation in medical matters can have consequences that extend far beyond academic curiosity. The mainstream historical fact that everyone knows is that the Jack the Ripper murders showed evidence of anatomical knowledge, suggesting the killer might have had medical training. But here's what they don't tell you in the sensationalized accounts. Victorian medical education was considerably more widespread than modern people assume, with barbers performing surgery, veterinarians treating humans in emergencies, and anyone with steady hands and minimal squeamishness potentially acquiring enough anatomical knowledge to perform basic procedures. Dr. Bond's analysis of Mary Ann Nichols reveals cuts that could have been made by someone with medical training, but also by a butcher, veterinarian, or anyone familiar with animal anatomy. The precision of the throat cuts suggests knowledge of where major blood vessels run, but this information was available in popular medical texts and wasn't exactly state secrets guarded by the Royal College of Surgeons. The examination of Annie Chapman's injuries presents more compelling evidence of specialized knowledge. The removal of her uterus was accomplished with what Dr. Bond describes as considerable anatomical skill, though he's careful to note that this could indicate either medical training or simply someone who'd had enough practice to develop expertise through repetition, rather like learning to play piano, except with considerably more disturbing implications. Here's a curiosity that most people don't know. Victorian London was full of people with unofficial medical experience. Medical students needed cadavers for dissection practice. Resurrection men supplied bodies through methods that weren't always strictly legal. And anyone working in slaughterhouses, tanneries, or similar industries would have developed familiarity with anatomy that could translate to human subjects with unfortunate ease. You watch Dr. Bond examined tissue samples under magnification that would make modern forensic specialists weep with frustration, trying to determine tool marks and cutting patterns using equipment that's barely adequate for the task. His conclusions are necessarily tentative, couched in the careful language of someone who understands that speculation presented as fact can derail an investigation faster than you can say medical jurisprudence. The double event presents particularly interesting forensic challenges, with Elizabeth Stride's relatively straightforward throat wound contrasting sharply with Catherine Edow's extensive mutilations. The difference in methodology suggests either two different killers, or one killer adapting his techniques based on available time and circumstances, like a performer adjusting his act based on the venue and audience. Catherine Edow's injuries reveal what Dr. Bond considers the most sophisticated anatomical work in the series. The removal of her kidney and part of her uterus was accomplished with surgical precision that suggests either genuine medical training or the kind of specialized knowledge that comes from sustained interest in human anatomy, combined with practical experience. Historians still debate whether the anatomical evidence points to a surgeon medical student, or simply someone with enough practical experience to fake medical knowledge convincingly. The truth probably lies somewhere in the spectrum between complete amateur and fully qualified physician, perhaps someone with enough training to understand basic anatomy, but not enough professional ethics to find better uses for this knowledge. The examination of Mary Jane Kelly's remains presents the most extensive evidence of anatomical activity, though the sheer scale of the mutilations makes determining skill level almost impossible. It's rather like trying to evaluate someone's cooking abilities by examining the aftermath of a kitchen explosion. There's clearly been considerable activity, but assessing competence becomes challenging when the evidence has been so thoroughly rearranged. Dr. Bond's medical background allows him to analyze not just the technical aspects of the injuries, but also their psychological implications. The progression from relatively simple throat cuts to elaborate post-mortem mutilation suggests someone who was learning, experimenting, or simply becoming more confident in expressing whatever twisted impulses drove these crimes. The tools used present another puzzle that occupies considerable investigative attention. The cuts suggest a sharp knife of medium length, possibly a surgical instrument, but equally likely a common pocket knife kept in good condition. Victorian London was full of sharp implements, from medical instruments to butcher's knives to the kind of general-purpose cutting tools that any working person might carry. You're struck by how the medical evidence both illuminates and obscures the truth about Jack the Ripper's identity. Each autopsy report provides more data, but also raises new questions about interpretation, methodology, and the relationship between knowledge and application. It's like assembling a jigsaw puzzle where each new piece reveals that the picture is more complex than you initially assumed. Dr. Bond's psychological profile, based on his medical examinations, describes someone who kills for the satisfaction of killing rather than for financial gain, sexual gratification, or conventional criminal motives. This represents one of the first attempts at criminal profiling, though it's necessarily limited by the medical and psychological understanding available in 1888. The debate over medical knowledge reflects broader Victorian anxieties about professional boundaries, education, and the potential misuse of specialized training. The idea that someone might use medical skills for murder rather than healing challenged assumptions about the relationship between education and moral character that formed the foundation of Victorian professional society. As you stand in Dr. Bond's examination room, surrounded by the tools and documentation of Victorian forensic medicine, you're reminded that scientific analysis is only as good as the tools and understanding available to perform it. The fog outside the windows seems almost appropriate, a visual metaphor for the limitations of even the most careful investigation when the evidence refuses to provide clear answers. The gas lamps flicker slightly, casting dancing shadows across the medical reports and autopsy photographs that document humanity's capacity for calculated evil. You find yourself wondering whether Dr. Bond ever went home and had trouble sleeping, whether examining such deliberate cruelty took a psychological toll that Victorian medical training hadn't quite prepared him to handle. You're walking through the newsroom of the Central News Agency, where the air buzzes with the particular energy that comes from journalists who've realized they're sitting on the story of the century, if only they can figure out what that story actually is. The clatter of typewriters creates a percussion section that would make any Victorian composer envious, except instead of creating symphonies, they're manufacturing headlines that will sell papers faster than hot pies on a cold morning. The gas lamps flicker over desks covered with telegram forms, press clippings, and the kind of frenzied note-taking that happens when reporters discover that reality has become more dramatic than anything they could possibly make up. You can smell printer's ink, cigarette smoke, and that particular mixture of excitement and deadline panic that seems to be the natural atmosphere of newspaper offices since someone first figured out that people would pay money to read about other people's misfortunes. George R. Sims adjusts his spectacles as he reviews the latest batch of copy, probably wondering when newspaper work shifted from reporting facts to to trying to determine which facts might actually be true among the avalanche of rumors, speculation, and outright fiction that's been pouring into London's newsrooms since the first Whitechapel murder. It's rather like trying to conduct a symphony orchestra, where half the musicians are playing different pieces, and the other half are making up their own compositions entirely. The mainstream historical fact that everyone knows is that the Jack the Ripper murders created unprecedented media coverage that helped establish modern tabloid journalism. But here's what they don't tell you in journalism school. The relationship between the press and the investigation became so complex that it's sometimes difficult to determine whether newspapers were reporting the story or actually helping to create it through their coverage decisions. You watch as reporters debate the ethics of publishing the Dear Boss letter, weighing public interest against the possibility that they might be providing exactly the kind of attention that the writer was seeking. It's a conversation that feels remarkably modern, except with considerably more pipe smoke and fewer concerns about social media algorithms, though the basic question of whether giving platforms to attention-seeking criminals might encourage copycat behavior remains frustratingly relevant. The decision to publish the letter transforms the case from local crime story to international sensation faster than you can say circulation figures. Within days, newspapers across Britain and internationally are running stories about the mysterious killer, who calls himself Jack the Ripper, complete with dramatic illustrations that make Whitechapel look like something from a Gothic novel, rather than an actual neighborhood where people are trying to go about their daily lives. Here's a curiosity that most people don't know. The Jack the Ripper story was one of the first international media sensations, with newspapers in America, Australia, and Europe running detailed coverage of murders that occurred in a relatively small area of East London. The speed of telegraph communication meant that people in New York were reading about Whitechapel murders almost as quickly as people in Westminster, a level of global media coverage that was unprecedented for local crime stories. You follow the story as it spreads through the Victorian media ecosystem, watching how each retelling adds new details, drops inconvenient facts, and generally transforms actual events into the kind of narrative that sells newspapers and keeps readers coming back for the next installment. It's like watching the birth of modern celebrity culture, except the celebrity in question is an anonymous killer with apparent medical training and a flair for dramatic timing. The illustrations that accompany newspaper stories create their own mythology around the murders, depicting Whitechapel as a hellscape of shadowy alleys and lurking danger that bears only passing resemblance to the actual neighborhood. Artists who've probably never ventured east of Aldgate create dramatic scenes that emphasize atmosphere over accuracy, contributing to a visual language around the case that will influence how people think about these crimes for decades to come. The competition between newspapers drives increasingly sensational coverage, with reporters offering rewards for information, publishing amateur detective theories, and generally treating the investigation like a serialized novel where readers expect new developments with each edition. Some papers begin running daily updates, even when there's nothing new to report, filling space with speculation that ranges from plausible to completely fantastic. You're struck by how the media coverage transforms the victims from individuals with their own stories into characters in a larger narrative about urban danger and social decay. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, and the others become symbols rather than people. Their personal histories simplified into the kind of dramatic backstories that serve the needs of newspaper serialization rather than historical accuracy. Historians still debate whether the extensive media coverage helped or hindered the police investigation, with some arguing that press attention brought forward witnesses who might not have come forward otherwise, while others contend that the circus atmosphere made serious investigation nearly impossible. The truth probably involves elements of both, a media-feeding frenzy that occasionally produced useful information, but mostly generated noise that made separating facts from fiction increasingly difficult. The international coverage reveals how the Jack the Ripper story tapped into anxieties that extended far beyond London's East End. American newspapers used the murders to comment on urban conditions in their own cities, while European papers saw them as evidence of British social problems. The case became a kind of mirror that reflected each country's concerns about urbanization, immigration, and social change. The letters to editors reveal how the case captured public imagination in ways that transformed passive newspaper readers into active participants in the investigation. People from across Britain and internationally wrote to suggest theories, report suspicious activities, and generally treat the manhunt like a kind of Victorian crowdsourcing project, though with considerably less reliable quality control than modern platforms might provide. The satirical publications of the time reveal how the case also became a source of dark humor, with Punch and other magazines running cartoons that mocked everything from police incompetence to media sensationalism. It's rather refreshing to discover that Victorian humor could be just as inappropriate as modern comedy, even if it required more elaborate setup and considerably more formal language to deliver the punchline. You find yourself wondering about the psychological impact of constant media coverage on the residents of Whitechapel, who had to navigate daily life while knowing that their neighborhood had become synonymous with danger in newspapers around the world. It must have been rather like living in a fishbowl, except the fish are being observed by people who are mostly interested in whether they're about to be eaten by something lurking in the castle decorations. The press coverage also reveals class dynamics that influenced how the story was told, with working-class victims receiving different treatment than they might have if they'd been middle-class women murdered in more respectable neighborhoods. The narrative focus on the killer rather than the victims reflects editorial decisions about what kinds of stories sell papers and what kinds of people merit sustained attention. As you prepare to leave the newsroom, surrounded by the controlled chaos of Victorian journalism in full swing, you're struck by how the Jack the Ripper case essentially created the template for modern media coverage of serial killers. The fog swirls outside the windows, but inside, the bright gas flames illuminate the birth of a new kind of storytelling, one that would influence how societies process and understand criminal cases for generations to come. You find yourself in the drawing room of a Victorian mansion, where the air itself seems heavy with secrets whispered behind silk fans and conspiracies hatched over brandy and cigars. The Persian carpet beneath your feet muffles your footsteps as you move between leather-bound chairs that have hosted conversations about matters far more complex than the weather or the latest theatrical productions. The gas lamps cast dancing shadows that seem almost appropriate for discussions of royal scandals, Masonic rituals, and the kind of political machinations that make ordinary murder look positively straightforward by comparison. The scent of tobacco smoke mingles with the particular mustiness that comes from rooms where powerful men gather to discuss problems that require solutions which will never appear in any official records. You can almost hear the ghost whispers of conversations that began with phrases like, "Something must be done about this unfortunate situation," and ended with agreements that no gentleman would ever acknowledge in polite society, or any other kind of society, for that matter. Sir William Gull sits in his chair with the assured confidence of someone who spent his career treating royalty, and has therefore developed immunity to the kind of shock that would send ordinary physicians reaching for their smelling salts. As Queen Victoria's personal physician, he possesses both the medical knowledge to perform the kind of surgical precision seen in the Ripper murders and the social connections that could theoretically arrange cover-ups more elaborate than a Victorian Christmas pantomime. The mainstream historical fact that everyone knows is that various conspiracy theories have linked the Jack the Ripper murders to royal scandals, Masonic cover-ups, and government conspiracies. But here's what they don't tell you in the sensationalized documentaries. Most of these theories were developed decades after the murders by people who had access to historical hindsight and apparently unlimited imagination for connecting dots that may not have actually been related in the first place. You examine the elaborate theory that places Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence, at the center of a scandal involving a secret marriage to a Catholic shopgirl, illegitimate children, and a subsequent cover-up that required eliminating witnesses through a series of murders disguised as the work of a mad killer. It's the kind of plot that would make Victorian novelists envious of its complexity. though they might question whether reality needs quite so many moving parts to create effective drama. The Masonic conspiracy adds another layer of intrigue that transforms the murders from criminal acts into ritualistic eliminations designed to protect state secrets. According to this theory, the positioning of bodies and the precision of mutilations follow Masonic symbolism, turning each crime scene into a kind of coded message that would be recognized by initiates but appear random to outsiders, rather like leaving crossword puzzle clues for people who don't know you're playing word games. Here's a curiosity that most people don't know. The royal conspiracy theories weren't proposed until the 1970s, nearly a century after the murders, when investigator Stephen Knight published research suggesting government cover-ups involving the highest levels of British society. The timing raises interesting questions about whether these theories reflect historical evidence or simply the kind of anti-establishment sentiment that became fashionable during that particular decade. You follow the trail of supposed evidence that connects Sir William Gull to the murders through a combination of medical expertise, royal connections, and the kind of moral flexibility that might allow someone to justify elimination of inconvenient witnesses as service to the crown. The theory suggests that Gull performed the murders as part of a conspiracy to protect Prince Albert Victor from scandal, using his medical knowledge to create the appearance of a mad killer while actually conducting systematic assassinations. The investigation into royal involvement reveals the challenges of researching crimes that supposedly required cover-ups extensive enough to fool investigators for more than a century. Every absence of evidence becomes proof of successful concealment. Every inconsistency becomes evidence of deliberate misdirection, and every alternative explanation becomes part of an even larger conspiracy designed to hide the truth from public scrutiny. Inspector Robert Anderson's memoirs, published years after his retirement, hint at knowledge of the killer's identity that was never publicly revealed, suggesting either genuine inside information or the kind of dramatic teasing that retired officials sometimes employ to maintain relevance in cases that defined their careers. His comments about the case being solved but unprosecutable could support conspiracy theories, or simply reflect the frustrations of investigating crimes with insufficient evidence for conviction. Historians still debate whether any royal conspiracy theories reflect genuine historical possibilities, or whether they represent the kind of elaborate fantasy that develops when unsolved cases attract enough attention to support creative speculation. The truth probably lies somewhere between complete fabrication and the kind of political sensitivity that surrounded any scandal involving the royal family during Victoria's reign. The logistics of organizing such a conspiracy present their own challenges that would make even experienced political operators pause to reconsider their career choices. Coordinating between royal physicians, government officials, police investigators, and various other parties while maintaining absolute secrecy would require the kind of organizational skills that most governments struggle to apply to considerably simpler projects like road repair or postal delivery. You're struck by how the royal conspiracy theories reflect broader anxieties about power, secrecy, and the relationship between official narratives and hidden truths. The idea that murders which terrorized ordinary citizens might have been committed to protect elite interests taps into suspicions about institutional power that extend far beyond the specific circumstances of the Whitechapel murders. The Masonic elements add ritualistic significance that transforms random violence into symbolic action, suggesting that even the most horrific crimes might serve purposes that transcend immediate criminal motives. Whether this reflects actual Masonic involvement, or simply the human tendency to find patterns and meaning in chaotic events, remains one of the many unresolved questions surrounding these theories. The social dynamics revealed in conspiracy theories show how class distinctions influenced both the crimes themselves and subsequent investigations. The idea that working-class women might have been killed to protect upper-class reputations reflects uncomfortable truths about Victorian society that extend beyond any specific criminal case. Though whether this general social reality translates into specific conspiracy remains hotly debated. You find yourself wondering about the psychological appeal of conspiracy theories that place Jack the Ripper's crimes within larger political contexts. Perhaps it's more comforting to imagine elaborate royal plots than to accept that random violence committed by unknown individuals can terrorize communities and resist solution despite the best efforts of investigators and theorists alike. The documentary evidence for royal involvement remains frustratingly ambiguous, consisting largely of hints, suggestions, and interpretations that support dramatic narratives but fall short of the kind of proof that would satisfy either criminal courts or academic historians. It's rather like trying to solve a murder mystery where the most interesting suspects are also the ones with the best alibis and most expensive lawyers. As you prepare to leave this drawing room of whispered conspiracies and shadowy implications, the fog outside the windows seems to mirror the opacity that surrounds these theories. You carry with you the knowledge that some questions may be more interesting than their answers, and that the search for truth sometimes reveals more about the searchers than about the subjects of their investigation. You're standing in a sleek laboratory where the hum of DNA sequencers mingles with the soft clicking of computer keyboards, creating a kind of digital lullaby that would have seemed like science fiction to the Victorian investigators who first walked the fog-shrouded streets of Whitechapel. The fluorescent lights cast everything in sharp relief, a stark contrast to the gas lamps that flickered over the original crime scenes. And you can smell that particular mixture of disinfectant and electronic equipment that speaks to humanity's ongoing attempt to solve mysteries through the application of increasingly sophisticated technology. Dr. Jari Luhalainen moves between workstations with the careful precision of someone who understands that 135-year-old evidence requires the kind of delicate handling usually reserved for newborn kittens or explosive devices. And honestly, Victorian-era DNA samples can be just as fragile and potentially dangerous to your career, if mishandled. His white lab coat rustles softly as he adjusts microscope settings, preparing to examine genetic material that has somehow survived more than a century of London weather, archival storage, and the kind of bureaucratic neglect that makes ancient Egyptian mummy preservation look positively state-of-the-art. The mainstream historical fact that everyone knows is that modern forensic techniques have been applied to Jack the Ripper evidence, including DNA analysis of artifacts from the crime scenes. But here's what they don't tell you in the dramatic television documentaries. DNA degrades over time with the persistence of Victorian social reform, gradually but thoroughly, and extracting usable genetic material from 19th century evidence requires methods so sophisticated that they make launching rockets look like assembling furniture from a Swedish catalog. You watch as technicians prepare samples from Catherine Eddowes's shawl, a piece of fabric that allegedly was present at the Mitre Square crime scene and has been passed down through generations like a particularly morbid family heirloom. The shawl itself looks remarkably ordinary for something that might hold the key to history's most famous unsolved case. Dark wool, with a pattern that suggests Victorian respectability, rather than the kind of dramatic significance that comes with being potential evidence in the world's most analyzed murder investigation. The process of extracting DNA from century-old fabric involves techniques that would have sounded like magical incantations to the investigators who originally handled this evidence. Polymerase chain reaction amplification, mitochondrial DNA sequencing, and various other procedures with names that require advanced degrees to pronounce correctly, let alone understand, though the basic principle remains reassuringly simple. Find tiny bits of genetic material and make enough copies to analyze. Here's a curiosity that most people don't know. Modern Ripper investigations use many of the same databases and techniques employed in contemporary criminal cases, creating an odd situation where Victorian-era evidence is processed using methods designed for 21st century crimes. It's rather like trying to restore a horse-drawn carriage using tools designed for spacecraft maintenance. Technically possible, but requiring considerable adaptation and creative problem-solving. The digital reconstruction of crime scenes represents another frontier in modern Ripper investigation, with researchers using 3D modeling software to recreate Victorian Whitechapel with the kind of precision that would have made original investigators weep with envy. You can walk through virtual representations of Bucks Row, Hanbury Street, and Mitre Square, examining sight lines, measuring distances, and analyzing timing with accuracy that Victorian tape measures and pocket watches couldn't possibly achieve. Geographic information systems allow investigators to map the murders with satellite precision, overlaying historical street layouts with modern analytical techniques to identify patterns that might have been invisible to investigators working with hand-drawn maps and limited resources. The killer's geographical behavior becomes data points that can be analyzed using algorithms designed to identify hunting patterns and predict future activities, though admittedly, this is somewhat less useful when the crimes occurred more than a century ago. Social media has transformed amateur investigation into a kind of crowdsourced research project that brings together armchair detectives from around the world, each contributing theories, evidence analysis, and speculation with the kind of democratic enthusiasm that would have horrified Victorian authorities. Online forums buzz with discussions of handwriting analysis, suspect identification, and crime scene interpretation that demonstrate how digital communication can turn historical mysteries into interactive entertainment. Historians still debate whether modern forensic techniques can provide definitive answers to questions that 19th century investigators couldn't resolve, or whether the passage of time has simply introduced new variables that complicate rather than clarify the evidence. The truth probably involves both possibilities: better tools revealing new information, while also highlighting how much evidence has been lost, contaminated, or misinterpreted over the decades. The psychological profiling techniques developed for modern serial killer investigations have been retrospectively applied to the Ripper case, creating behavioral analyses that attempt to reconstruct the killer's personality, motivations, and likely characteristics using methods that rely on statistical analysis of contemporary criminal behavior. Whether Victorian serial killers operated according to the same psychological patterns as modern ones remains an open question that requires considerable speculation. Digital archives have made historical documents more accessible than ever before, allowing researchers to examine police reports, newspaper accounts, and personal correspondence that might have been locked away in institutional storage for decades. The democratization of historical research means that anyone with internet access can potentially discover connections that eluded professional investigators, though it also means sorting through considerably more speculation and creative interpretation than traditional academic research typically involves. You find yourself amazed by how technology has transformed the relationship between past and present, allowing modern investigators to examine Victorian evidence using tools that would have seemed like pure fantasy to the original investigators. The irony isn't lost on you that some of the most advanced scientific techniques currently available are being applied to crimes committed during an era when medical understanding was still debating whether diseases were caused by bad air and moral failings. The DNA evidence from the shawl has produced results that some researchers claim definitively identify the killer, while others argue that contamination, degradation, and methodological concerns make any conclusions premature at best. It's rather like trying to read a book where most of the pages are missing, and the remaining ones have been through a washing machine. You can make out some words, but whether they form a coherent narrative remains frustratingly unclear. Artificial intelligence algorithms are now being applied to handwriting analysis of the Ripper letters, using pattern recognition software to identify characteristics that human analysts might miss. Whether machine learning can solve mysteries that have stumped human investigators for more than a century remains to be seen, though there's something appealingly optimistic about the idea that computers might succeed where traditional detective work has fallen short. As you prepare to leave this modern laboratory where ancient mysteries meet cutting-edge technology, you're struck by the persistence of human curiosity and the lengths to which people will go to answer questions that resist easy solutions. The soft hum of equipment continues its digital lullaby, processing data that might or might not finally provide answers to questions that have fascinated investigators for more than a century. The fluorescent lights create an environment where shadows are eliminated rather than emphasized, a stark contrast to the fog-shrouded gaslight world where these crimes originally occurred. Yet somehow, Despite all the technological advancement and scientific sophistication, Jack the Ripper remains as elusive as ever. A reminder that some mysteries may be more resistant to solution than others, regardless of how sophisticated our tools become. You find yourself standing at the edge of time itself, where the fog of 1888 mingles with the digital haze of modern obsession, and you realize that Jack the Ripper has achieved something that even he probably never intended: immortality through mystery. The gas lamps have long since been replaced by LED streetlights, the cobblestones covered by asphalt, and the Victorian investigators replaced by amateur sleuths armed with internet connections and theories that would make Sherlock Holmes reach for his pipe and contemplate early retirement. The question that whispers through the centuries like London fog is not really who Jack the Ripper was, but why we need him to be anyone at all. You're standing in a world where serial killers have been studied, profiled, and categorized with scientific precision. Yet this particular monster continues to elude not just identification, but explanation, as if he's become less a person than a principle, a walking embodiment of the unknowable darkness that lurks just beyond the comfortable boundaries of rational understanding. You walk through modern Whitechapel, where trendy coffee shops occupy buildings that once housed gin palaces, and young professionals carrying laptops hurry past the spots where Mary Ann Nichols and Annie Chapman met their ends. The neighborhood has been gentrified with the thoroughness of Victorian moral reform, completely transformed, yet somehow carrying ghostly echoes of its darker history like a persistent cough that modern medicine can't quite cure. The mainstream historical fact that everyone knows is that Jack the Ripper became a cultural icon, whose influence extends far beyond the specific crimes committed in 1888. But here's what they don't tell you in the analysis of his cultural impact. He represents something that modern society thought it had eliminated through scientific progress and social reform. The reminder that some questions don't have answers, some problems don't have solutions, and some monsters prefer to remain monsters rather than become case studies. You consider how Jack the Ripper has evolved from Victorian bogeyman to modern entertainment franchise, spawning countless books, films, television series, and walking tours that transform sites of historical tragedy into tourist attractions. It's rather like turning a graveyard into a theme park, technically possible, but requiring a level of psychological distance that says interesting things about how societies process trauma and transform horror into consumable narrative. The academic conferences devoted to Ripper research reveal how the case has become a kind of scholarly perpetual motion machine, generating papers, theories, and heated debates that ensure the mystery remains commercially viable, regardless of whether it ever gets actually solved. You can almost hear the collective sigh of relief from Ripperologists worldwide whenever a new theory is debunked, because solving the case would essentially put them all out of business. Here's a curiosity that most people don't know. Jack the Ripper merchandise generates millions of pounds annually for London's tourism industry, making him one of the city's most profitable historical residents, despite having committed only 5 confirmed murders in a relatively small geographic area. It's the kind of economic success story that would make Victorian entrepreneurs weep with envy if they could overlook the slight moral complications involved. You find yourself wondering about the psychological appeal of unsolved mysteries in an age when GPS can track your movements, DNA can identify suspects from microscopic evidence, and social media makes privacy about as achievable as keeping secrets in a Victorian boarding house. Perhaps Jack the Ripper endures precisely because he represents the last great mystery from an era when the world still had genuine unknowns rather than just temporarily unresolved questions. The feminist interpretations of the case have transformed the narrative from one focused on the killer to one that centers the victims, examining how Victorian society's treatment of working-class women created the conditions that made such crimes possible, while simultaneously ensuring they would be sensationalized rather than prevented. It's a perspective that would probably mystify Victorian investigators, who approach the case as a problem of criminal identification rather than social analysis. The conspiracy theories that continue to multiply around the case reveal how Jack the Ripper has become a kind of historical Rorschach test, reflecting the fears and obsessions of each generation of investigators. Where Victorians saw moral decay and urban danger, modern theorists find government cover-ups, medical experimentation, and the kind of systematic institutional evil that speaks to contemporary anxieties about power and secrecy. Historians still debate whether the continued fascination with Jack the Ripper represents healthy engagement with historical mystery or unhealthy obsession with violence against women. The truth probably involves both elements. Genuine historical curiosity, mixed with the darker psychological appetites that make crime documentaries more popular than educational programming about agricultural policy or municipal water management. You're struck by how the case has become a mirror that reflects changing attitudes toward crime, punishment, mental illness, and social responsibility. Each generation of investigators brings their own assumptions about human nature, criminal behavior, and the relationship between individual pathology and social conditions, creating an evolving interpretation that says as much about the interpreters as about the original events. The digital age has democratized Ripper research in ways that would have amazed Victorian investigators, allowing amateur enthusiasts to access historical documents, share theories, and collaborate on investigations that might uncover connections professional researchers have missed. Whether this represents progress or simply the multiplication of speculation remains an open question that generates heated debate in online forums devoted to the case. The international appeal of the Jack the Ripper story reveals how certain types of mystery transcend cultural boundaries, tapping into universal fears about urban danger, anonymous violence, and the limits of official protection. The case has inspired similar investigations in countries that never experienced anything comparable, suggesting that Jack the Ripper has become less a historical figure than a template for understanding how societies process inexplicable evil. As you prepare to leave this contemplation of eternal questions and perpetual mysteries, the modern streetlights cast sharp shadows that somehow seem less mysterious than the flickering gas lamps of 1888. Perhaps that's the real explanation for Jack the Ripper's enduring appeal. In an age when technology promises to eliminate uncertainty, he remains gloriously, frustratingly unknowable. The fog has lifted from Whitechapel's streets, replaced by the kind of urban haze that comes from traffic and central heating, rather than coal fires and industrial smoke. Yet somewhere in that modern atmosphere, Jack the Ripper continues his nocturnal prowling, not through physical streets, but through the collective imagination of a world that needs its monsters to remain monstrous, its mysteries to stay mysterious, and its questions to resist easy answers. You carry with you the knowledge that some stories are more important than their conclusions, some cases more valuable than their solutions, and some mysteries more revealing when they remain mysterious than when they're finally explained. In the end, perhaps Jack the Ripper's greatest crime wasn't murder, but the theft of certainty itself, leaving behind a world where the fog never quite lifts and the footsteps in the darkness might belong to anyone at all. The city sleeps around you, its millions of residents safe in their beds, protected by modern security systems and well-lit streets. Yet, in the quietest hours before dawn, when the urban noise subsides to a gentle whisper, you can almost hear those Victorian footsteps echoing through time, a reminder that some shadows are longer than others, and some stories refuse to end just because we've run out of pages to write them on. The gentle hum of the modern city cradles you like a lullaby, its rhythm steady and reassuring. Traffic lights blink in patient sequence, heating systems maintain comfortable temperatures, and security cameras keep their silent vigil over streets that no longer hide the kind of dangers that once stalked through gaslit alleys. The world has grown safer, more predictable, more knowable in countless ways. Yet as you settle into the comfort of contemporary certainty, Jack the Ripper remains what he has always been. Not quite real, not quite myth, but something hovering in that twilight space between fact and legend, where the most persistent mysteries make their home. His story continues to unfold, not because new evidence emerges, but because each generation finds new questions to ask of old shadows. The fog of time swirls gently around these thoughts, softer now, warmer, carrying you towards sleep on currents of historical wonder and modern comfort. In your dreams tonight, perhaps you'll walk those Victorian streets one more time, but safely now, as an observer rather than a participant, watching from the gentle distance that separates storytelling from reality, mystery from menace, and the darkness of the past from the protective light of the present moment. Sleep well, knowing that some stories are meant to be told rather than solved, and that the best mysteries are those that remain mysterious, keeping their secrets safe in the gentle embrace of time itself.